People don't seem to understand that the current conflict that's going on in the Donbas region, this is the third Donbas war. The third Donbas war in the last 10 years. The first one started in 2014 after the coup d'etat overthrew the legitimate government and installed this neo-Nazi regime, because that's what they are. That's what they've always been. It was a neo-Nazi coup d'etat supported by the American State Department and a bunch of NGOs. It was another color revolution. They called it the Revolution of Dignity, but it was a coup d'etat, simple as. And the people in the Donbas, who are ethnically Russian, wanted no part of this revolution, and they wanted no part in this neo-Nazi regime that was being installed. And so they wanted some autonomy because they didn't want to fall under the yoke of these neo-Nazis. And that's why the first Donbas war started. It's as simple as that. It started in 2014, and it really gained steam in the summer and fall of 2014. And that led to the first Minsk protocol, I believe they called it. And it was basically an agreement to sort of like a ceasefire. And that agreement was signed and all the rest of it. The French and the Germans acted as intermediaries. And it was sort of signed, but the fascist regime in Kiev started, attacking the Donbas, the cities of Donetsk and the rest of it, shelling them and whatnot. And the ceasefire ended, and there was more conflict until the Donbas militiamen captured the Donetsk airport. And that's when negotiations were started for what was called the Minsk II agreement. And that was signed in February of 2015, I do believe. Now, since then, February 2015, the Ukrainian side refused to live by the Minsk II agreement because the government in Kiev was dominated by neo-Nazis that didn't want to reestablish a good relationship with the Donbas. No, they wanted to destroy Donbas, to carry out genocide. They said so on TV, man. There are videos of a lot of the muckety-mucks of these fascists saying that they want to kill Russian people living in the Donbas, that they want to wipe them out. They say so on Ukrainian TV, and it's floating out there on YouTube with subtitles and everything. They said this. See? And now, the war started. Why did it start? Well, because the Zelensky regime, at NATO's instigation, probably, we will find out eventually, but it's likely, the Zelensky regime was putting together an invading army in the Donbas. You're hearing now the Battle of the Donbas. You're hearing how the Russians are set to capture something like potentially 25,000 Ukrainian troops there. How are they there? Well, very simple. They were there before the war because they were the ones who were going to attack the Donbas and try to take the Donbas in a blitzkrieg. And they were potentially going to cross the border into Russia and attack Russia just to show them who's boss. Which is just stupid and crazy and absurd. And that's when you start to understand that this invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces was a preemptive strike. Because the war was going to happen. And it wasn't at the instigation of the Russians. It was at the instigation of the Zelensky regime taking its orders from Washington. Washington was the one that pushed for this. It's very obvious. And at this time, we do not have the documentary evidence or the testimony of people who were in the room when the decisions were made. Not yet. We will get that confirmation, that documentary evidence, and that testimony. It's inevitable because people talk. And once this whole thing is settled down, then we'll get a better sense of what's what. But we know that this is the case. Why? Because right now, the Russians are capturing so many men. It doesn't make any sense why all of these men were there, other than the fact that they were being assembled to carry out this invasion of the Donbas. And so when they say that Russia attacked unprovoked, that's a lie. They were provoked. In fact, by the rules of law, by international law, this was a justified preemptive attack because the war was going to happen anyway. Anyway, why am I telling you all of this stuff? Well, because you have to understand that this conflict didn't come out of the blue. This conflict cannot be solved by diplomacy. That's the thing, and you realize now that the Russians were very naive in this thinking that they could solve this by negotiations or a peace agreement or a ceasefire of some sort. Because the first Minsk protocol failed because the neo-Nazi regime that had been taken over the government of Ukraine refused. They just went along with the negotiation process, but actually implementing them, they had no intention. They didn't implement the first one. They certainly didn't implement the second Minsk agreement, which was signed, like I said, in February of 15. They had 7 years to implement those agreements, and they never did. And they always had excuses, or for some reason or another, they never implemented them. And when the Russians went in, it's very clear that the first phase was to basically intimidate and scare the Zelensky regime into some sort of ceasefire agreement. That's very obvious, because what they wanted, really, was they didn't want to have, the Russians clearly didn't want to have a full-on war, but they did want Ukraine neutrality. That's what they wanted. That was a real thing. They wanted Ukraine, guarantees that Ukraine would never join NATO and would never host NATO troops in its territory. That's what they really wanted. And they just didn't get it. They would never get it. Because after the coup d'etat, the various governments in Kiev have all been puppeteered by Washington. And Washington has said very clearly to Zelensky on multiple occasions, you cannot have a ceasefire. The whole point of this war is to weaken Russia. The US Secretary of Defense has stated this openly. The whole point of this is to weaken Russia as much as possible and fight Russia to the last Ukrainian soldier. That's the stated goal of the United States. And so Russia will never sign any kind of peace deal with Kiev. And that means that Ukraine will be partitioned. It will be broken up. And the East and the Donbas and the South, including Odessa, the Russians are going to take all of that over. When I heard in very early April that in Kherson, which the Russians had captured and were administering, they had implemented a program whereby the citizens were going to use Russian rubles as their currency for local commerce, that's when, for me, the game was up. That's their intention. A couple of days ago, the Russians announced that the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that they control, that they are operating, it will happily sell electrical power to the Ukrainians. But, they're not going to get it back. What does that tell you? You think that the Russians are going anywhere from Zaporozhye? They're not going anywhere. This whole area, and I include the city where I'm currently standing in, Kharkov, all of this area is going to become part of Russia. I've said it before, I'm saying it again. It's inevitable. And it is because the Kiev regime, after the 2014 coup, followed along with all the stupid ideas of the Washington bureaucrats. People like Victoria Nuland and Anthony Blinken and all these morons, because they're all morons. They followed along and they kept insisting that there'd be no peace deal. If they'd signed a peace deal, thousands upon thousands of people would still be alive. Soldiers, young men with future. And they're all dead for nothing. It's because of these bureaucrats. And were it not for these bureaucrats, Ukraine as a nation would have a future. And this is the part that I'm not kidding around at all. I'm as dead serious as I've ever been. This is the part that breaks my heart, because I was talking to a friend yesterday. we were having a long and very intelligent conversation. I'm not going to mention who it is, but he's an online personality, and he's a political fixture in Europe. He's a smart guy. And we were talking about the future of Ukraine. And one of the things that people don't seem to understand, see, the Ukrainian women have left. They've left the country, and they've gone to Europe. And because of the border restrictions, fighting age men can't leave Ukraine unless they're rich enough to pay off the right policeman or the right border guard to let them through. And so the people who are remaining in Ukraine are the defeated army. And the smart people, the educated people, and the women and children are leaving Ukraine. Estimates at this time are that 6 million Ukrainians have left Ukraine. At least a third of the population has been displaced. The population of Ukraine prior to the conflict was 45 million. And so at least a third of those people, roughly 15 million, have been displaced. That is, they are no longer living at this time in their normal home. But of those 15 million who have been displaced, it is estimated that at least 6 million are outside of the country. It's something like, I do believe the latest figures that seem to be on the ball say something like close to 5 million in Western Europe and over 1 million in Russia. And those people are likely never coming back. They're going to find lives for themselves, especially the women. And why am I focusing on the women, right? Am I sexist? No, I'm not sexist. Well, some people think I am, but that's not the point, or the reason I'm focusing on the women. Because you see, women form homes. Women have babies, whatever anybody says otherwise, okay? The women have the babies, and if they leave the country, they're not going to have babies in the country now, are they? They're going to have the babies elsewhere. And they're going to find, some nice Swiss guy or some nice German guy or some nice French guy or some nice Greek guy or Italian guy or wherever it is that they wind up going. They're going to find some nice guy over there who's going to treat them nice. And they're going to have babies with that guy in that country instead of in Ukraine. And so the demographic problem that Ukraine was having before, because it was having a very serious demographic problem, with so many people, the educated, smart, driven people of Ukraine leaving the country for better opportunities in Europe, well, that's only been exacerbated. And all of a sudden, Ukraine as a nation has been completely hollowed out, demographically speaking. And this is the true tragedy of it. I mean, quite apart from the tragedy, the heartbreak of all these dying young men, the country is being hollowed out. And the longer this continues, the more the hollowing out will be. God alone knows how many people are exiting the country. But do you know how many people are dying per day? 500 soldiers per day. 500 Ukrainian soldiers per day are dying at the front. These numbers are astronomical, and they are gutting this country. So understand what's going on. And understand, too, that the people responsible are in Washington. Zelensky, his whole crew of neo-Nazis, all those crazy-ass people, they are just taking advantage of the situation for their own crazy ideology and for their own financial benefit. And that's the truth. But the people pulling the strings are in Washington. They are the ones who have destroyed this country. They are the ones who killed Ukraine.